But it's brutally still. Nah, you know.
Okay, we are recording, so, and I can, edit out the beginning here, but welcome back for folks who are in the room and also, watching this after the fact. I'm Dr. Corey Barker, associate professor at Bradley University. I got tenure right before our last session or right after, so that's exciting. And we're here to continue our series talking about, issues related to media literacy and using media in ways that feel productive and responsible and healthy. And today, or in this month, we're going to talk about social media and some of the concerns with social media and maybe how to use social media a little bit more responsibly. To do that, I always like to check in with what people do in relationship to whatever our topic is and kind of then what they say about their usage. So if I can click ahead here, there we go. Pew Research, I always use, they do great sort of cross-sectional surveys of people across the country and various media or opinion related things. So a recent survey data, so this is from the fall, US adults, what is your relationship to social media? And you can see here the most popular result as far as what people have ever used. This is not necessarily regular use, but just have you used these platforms. YouTube is actually number one pretty significantly. Sometimes I think we don't necessarily consider YouTube like social media in the same way that we think about, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. But it is a really popular one and is part of this survey. Facebook at 68%, and then pretty significant drop off even from there. Instagram, Pinterest, TikTok are emergent one. Notably Twitter, which is often the sort of focus of news and misinformation and that sort of thing. Only 22% of people have said they've ever even used it, not even regular usage, right? So the people who do use platforms like Twitter are often like heavy, what is often referred to as a super user, right? Someone who is, if you use Twitter, oftentimes like you really, really do use it a lot. Whereas things like YouTube and Facebook are just more like mass products, right? That are integrated into people's everyday lives a lot in a different way. The one on the right just shows us a little bit of the trajectory of growth or lack thereof, right? And it's a little busy there in the bottom right corner, but you can see, since they've been doing this survey since 2012, and notably they didn't start asking about YouTube until 2018, which I think is interesting. But YouTube's gone up a little bit. Facebook has kind of trailed off. Instagram, our third line there, has gone up, pretty steadily. And a lot of the other ones, it's still, kind of relatively small. TikTok is a dark green line, so it's kind of jumped up pretty consistently over the last couple of years, but it's new. So folks in the audience, how does this reflect your use of social media? Like, which ones are you using?
I am a heavy Twitter user.
Okay.
I'm up to about 12,000 followers right now.
Wow.
And so I'm a Twitter person. I use Facebook a little bit. I can hardly stand it. And I can stand up there and give the lecture this information.
Sure.
Facebook.
Yeah. Which we talked a little bit about last month.
I use Instagram some. And Pinterest. I look at recipes on it.
Yep.
I have TikTok. I don't really use it
that
much.
Yeah.
I was on LinkedIn. To me is kind of a has-been. I'm on LinkedIn. You
Yeah.
can probably find me on there, but
Not using it super actively.
no,
Yeah.
not when I was more active professionally.
Yeah.
I'm also on Tribal and Counter Social.
Yeah. What
Twitter's my main.
what are you posting on Twitter that has gotten you so many followers? Anything?
I'm diehard liberal Democrat.
Okay, so politics specifically. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So you would be what people refer to as like a super user on Twitter, right? Like someone who's deeply invested in a particular topic, pretty sizable, base of people who are active also talking about that topic, right? Um, Interesting, fascinating, cool. Catherine.
Yeah, well, I use WhatsApp a lot, but I didn't even think of it as a social media.
Yeah.
thing. I use it to message friends and family,
Yeah,
similarly to texting.
yeah,
I'm on Facebook, but I hardly ever go on there anymore.
yeah,
Cause it was, yeah, too much noise.
yeah,
Instagram sometimes mainly to look at pictures that my siblings have posted.
Yeah.
Or my,
yeah,
sometimes I get ideas on Pinterest for a library program. or
yeah.
something like that. Watch a YouTube video or, but yeah, I don't do a whole lot on social media.
Yeah. Well,
I would like to say though.
yeah, please.
My thoughts on your graph,
Yeah,
I think young men, they're the YouTube users.
yeah,
They're not gonna look up anything, they're not gonna read anything. A lot of them, there's just a lot of younger guys. And I'm saying this, having a son and my son's friends, they really dislike reading. And so they're getting everything
Yep.
from YouTube.
Yep.
And anybody could make a YouTube video.
yes. YouTube and Reddit are particularly the saturation of folks who are men and younger men, and this chart kind of underlining who's using what. I actually filtered for education, but we could do the same thing for gender if we pulled it up here. Just kind of seeing, the youngest adults are more likely to use Instagram, Snapchat and TikTok, right? And then age differences are less pronounced for Facebook. But you can see, like for instance, if you look at the Facebook is at the bottom, all of those dots are really close together because, a lot of generations use Facebook. It's kind of a default, or at least have accounts, right? Whereas something like Instagram, the top one, ages 65 and older, only 15% of those folks have it versus 78% of 18 to 29-year-olds. So there's a pretty stark difference generationally there. I filtered through education just as a different thing to talk about. You mentioned gender, but you can see there some of these things are kind of the data is replicated where YouTube, which is in the middle here, there's a pretty large saturation across all of them, like 74% of people high school or less, 85 some college, 89 college graduate, right? So like it's so popular that everybody's using it really kind of no matter their education status. But there are some that there's a little bit more of a pronounce, right? Obviously LinkedIn, you're seeing some college and more college graduate than high school or less. And something like where's Twitter? Yeah, Twitter, more college graduates than not, right? So there's some dynamics here, but a lot of that it kind of plays out age, gender as well, right? So what we do with social media, okay, then like what are people who use social media saying about it? Their use of social media. I've got a couple things here just to underline this, right? Some of this is a little bit more on the political side, and this survey is from 2020 on the left. US adults who say social media have a blank effect on the way things are going in the country. US adults, 64% of those who were surveyed in 2020 say mostly negative. Only 10% say mostly positive. And you can see how that's kind of broken down by self-identification of political ideology, right? More people who self-identify as conservatives suggest that it's, 83% of them suggest mostly negative. Then folks were asked, what are the negative effects? So that top 64% who said mostly negative, they were asked then, like, why do you say mostly negative? 28% say misinformation and made up news, which we talked about last time and we can touch on again here. 16% hate, harassment, extremism, 11% people believing everything, not knowing what to believe. So, often like framing it as like, I know what's going on, but everybody I'm seeing on social media doesn't know anything or they believe everything. And then a drop, censorship, too much negativity, partisanship, echo chamber, which we'll talk a little bit about, anti-conservative views, sensationalism, privacy. Actually, a small percentage of people mentioned impact on mental health, which we'll talk a little bit about here today. So people obviously actively use social media, right? Like 60% of the world is actively using social media at one time or another. But at least here in the US, people who are using it are saying like, it's not great and it creates kind of a bad environment, right? A really interesting anecdote here from an article that just came out in the Atlantic that is from Jonathan Haidt, he's written some really provocative books. He's got a new one out that we're going to talk a little bit about. But an anecdote he had in the article kind of previewing the book. A recent study from the University of Chicago, the study was done by an economist. Not that that's a bad thing, but this is, they're thinking about this sort of economically in some regards. So the researchers recruited more than 1,000 college students and asked them how much they'd need to be paid to deactivate either Instagram or TikTok for 4 weeks, okay? Trying to figure out what is the value of this product to society. On average, students said they'd need to be paid roughly $50, $59 for TikTok because it's more valuable, or $47 for Instagram to deactivate whichever platform they were asked about. Then the experimenters told students that they were going to try to get the most, that they were going to try to get most of the others in their school to deactivate the same platform, offering to pay them to do so as well, and asked, now, how much would you have to be paid as a person to deactivate your social media if you knew that everybody else was going to as well? The answer on average was less than zero. In each case, most students said, in fact, if I knew that my peers were also going to agree to be off social media, I would pay for that privilege. So they're simultaneously saying, I would have to be paid to keep doing it. But if you're telling me the sort of social impact of, network effects that all of my friends, all the folks in my physical social networks are saying, I'm off of TikTok. They're saying, literally, I would pay for that privilege. Like that, I don't like being on this platform, and I'm on it primarily because I know everybody else is, and I can't be left out, right? But I don't actually enjoy it to the point of being willing to pay $5, $10, $15 to know I'm off of it, my friends are off of it, it's out of my life, right? Later in this study, the students were asked directly, would you prefer to live in a world without Instagram or TikTok? A majority of students said yes, 58% for each app, right? So people who are heavy users, self-identified users, younger people in college are saying, I would pay a certain amount of money to stay on, but I would really love to pay if I knew that everybody else got off of it. And we could collectively just say no. But the social pressure of, people are on it. So what are we going to do? We got to stay on it, right? I think the concerns, obviously, that manifest with social media are also connected to just general concerns about screen time, which we could talk about more in depth in a future session. But obviously, our smart devices enable the path of least resistance as far as our access to basically any type of information, media, content, whatever you want to say. All of our devices use persuasive design to get us to pay attention to them, to trigger, things in our mind that we have to pick them up, from notifications to sounds to the instant connectivity to endless information or people, right? Obviously, all of these devices make it so easy, and we keep getting constant reminders, even when we're on a platform like YouTube or TikTok, that it's just auto playing, right? So even if you're not on there for a particular reason, it is so easy to just keep playing something or keep watching something because it's just there, right? So I think that's a bigger picture concern about screen time, and obviously there's a lot of research and discourse that's going into that. But if we were to break down maybe some big categories about what we're concerned about related to social media, they're replicated in that survey data, right? Circulation of misinformation, the negative impacts on sort of mental health, the potential censorship of information or the lack thereof, depending on your perspective on this issue. And then what is concepts that are referred to as filter bubbles or echo chambers. We talked about mis and disinformation last time. And, we've touched on different types of kind of information circulation that addresses censorship or lack thereof. And we can touch on that a little bit here. I actually wanted to talk about more today, the negative impacts or potential impacts on mental health, and then the filter bubble or echo chamber concept. And then, think about what concerns are there. So you may be familiar with the concept of a filter bubble. And this is a concept that's been around for more than a decade now. This, interesting thinker, Eli Parser, does TED Talk that's really popular. I'll play a brief example of it here. And then writes a book, The Filter Bubble, How the New Personalized Web is Changing What We Read and How We Think, right? So if I can just play a quick segment from this here. If it'll play. It played before. Well, that's silly. I wonder if it's because I'm screen sharing. Sometimes Zoom can be a little tricky with our embed. So if I just do this, play it this way, it's gonna be fine. Play it here. Oh, the screen share is being
Mark Zuckerberg, a journalist, was asking him a question about the news feed. And the journalist was asking him, why is this so important? And Zuckerberg said, a squirrel dying in your front yard may be more relevant to your interests right now than people dying in Africa. And I want to talk about what a web based on that idea of relevance might look like. So when I was growing up in a really rural area in Maine, the internet meant something very different to me. It meant a connection to the world. It meant something that would connect us all together. And I was sure that it was going to be great for democracy and for our society. But there's this kind of shift in how information is flowing online. And it's invisible. And if we don't pay attention to it, it could be a real problem. So I first noticed this in a place I spend a lot of time, my Facebook page. I'm progressive politically, big surprise, but I've always gone out of my way to meet conservatives. I like hearing what they're thinking about. I like seeing what they link to. I like learning a thing or two. And so I was kind of surprised when I noticed one day that the conservatives had disappeared from my Facebook feed. And what it turned out was going on was that Facebook was looking at which links I clicked on. And it was noticing that actually I was clicking more on my liberal friends' links than on my conservative friends' links. And without consulting me about it, it had edited them out. They disappeared. So Facebook isn't the only place that's doing this kind of invisible algorithmic editing of the web. Google's doing it too. If I search for something and you search for something, even right now at the very same time, we may get very different search results. Even if you're logged out, one engineer told me, there are 57 signals that Google looks at. Everything from what kind of computer you're on, to what kind of browser you're using, to where you're located, that it uses to personally tailor your query results. Think about it for a second. There is no standard Google anymore. And the funny thing about this is that it's hard to see. You can't see how different your search results are from anyone else's. But a couple of weeks ago, I asked a bunch of friends to Google Egypt and to send me screenshots of what they got. So here's my friend Scott's screenshot. And here's my friend Daniel's screenshot. when you put them side by side, you don't even have to read the links to see how different these two pages are. But when you do read the links, it's really quite remarkable. Daniel didn't get anything about the protests in Egypt at all in his first page of Google results. Scott's results were full of them. And this was the big story of the day at that time. That's how different these results are becoming. So it's not just Google and Facebook either. You know, this is something that's sweeping the web. There are a whole host of companies that are doing this kind of personalization.
Okay, so this is maybe a familiar concept by now because this presentation is given in 2011. The book comes out in 2013 or 2014. And there is, you know, sort of this extensive focus as all of these social platforms really start to focus on the algorithmic timeline and showing people not the most recent, you know, tweets or the most recent posts on a Facebook feed, but showing you things that they think are going to be like personally relevant to you, right? So this idea of the filter bubble comes to take on pretty significant, you know, purchase among scholars, among people who are thinking about these ideas and how they affect us, right? So, you know, the filter bubble argument is that we eventually, through the use of all these platforms, start to create, you know, an ideological bubble around ourselves. We start seeing more and more personalized results that underline and reflect our own identity back to us. That's sort of similar to a broader idea of an echo chamber, right? That you create an environment around yourself where you meet information and people that confirm your priors, that match your point of view, that allow you to continue to, like, you know, use confirmation bias. This is the world as I see it, so I continue to see that. So both of these concepts received an increased amount of attention in the 2010s as we got more social platforms, as Amazon and Google and Apple and the big tech companies got more and more powerful. And that, you know, creates this idea in the media and in sort of everyday life in some form that this is what happens through using these platforms, right? So what might you suspect are some of the potential consequences of these ideas, right? If this is true, right, that we create these sort of filter bubbles for ourselves, what does that mean for the world? Is that a positive? Is that a negative? What do you think?
Well, like you said, it's confirmation bias, it's a negative. That, and I think, you know, people thinking that everybody thinks like they do, even though there's a whole other half of, like, for politically,
Totally.
that don't think like that, so you can get big divides on that.
Yeah.
Or I think of conspiracy theories
Yeah.
out there that some people are heavily into, and so they're grouped up and they think that more people are a part of it than really are.
Yep.
It's probably a small percentage.
Yep.
But what they're saying is, well, almost everybody
Yep.
believes
Yeah.
that there's lizard people.
Yeah, so you're extrapolating from a smaller sample size than actually exists, right? And the intensity of those dynamics or those relationships that can form in those smaller, you know, subcultures or cultures online, right? Like every culture online is essentially a subculture. You can find anybody who is interested in anything or believes anything, right? Yeah, that you not only confirm your own beliefs, but then you start to believe that your beliefs are the norm, and anything that is outside of that mindset is either totally off base or oppositional, or if you take it to a, you know, anti-democratic or evil or whatever, right? Yeah, and I mean, I think obviously there's been so much writing and documentaries and workshops and things that are focused on, you know, the ways in which the big tech platforms in social media and, you know, the Amazons and Googles of the world, right? And the ways in which they facilitate this experience for us, right? And how they also use it to obviously drive us to like buy more stuff, right? Which is something that is very clear in the way in which these platforms, whether immediately or have eventually over the last 10 or 15 years, been just totally integrated with ads, right? So that you're seeing the same ads across these different platforms over and over again, trying to, really influence your purchasing decisions. But certainly, these ideas over the last 15 years have really taken purchase in general sort of pop culture psychology or sociology about like what's going on with the internet, right? So naturally, like a lot of serious researchers have tried to confirm, like, does this actually like happen, right? Do we, using these platforms, are we actually going into these bubbles? What do these, sort of small but active networks look like? And do they actually lead to increased political or social polarization? Do they lead to the circulation of mis and disinformation? Do they lead to political extremism, right? And the results are actually surprisingly mixed. It's certainly something that's difficult to analyze because all of these platforms have, proprietary control over their architecture and their infrastructure, so it can be hard to study them. One sort of research project was looking at media sources and also sort of active social media users that are central to the circulation of political information online. And I don't know why that's a little blurry, but in the middle there, using network analysis of articles shared or referenced on the web, Twitter, and Facebook, authors found that the structure and composition of media on the right and left are quite different. The center of gravity of the overall media landscape is center left based on this analysis. And partisan media sources on the left are less important than those kind of center left news sources, right? So this graph is identifying, your classic news sources as center left, and the things that are politically to the left of that don't hold a lot of purchase with a general, center left identifying person. On the other hand, the center of attention and influence for conservative media is much further to the right, notably more prominent than the center right. So they're trying to underline that, there's a little bit more pronounced extremism and attention paid to extremist news sources on the right than in the left. And there have been tons of different books that have focused on like, what are the impacts of this situation with bubbles and echo chambers? Prominent people like President Obama, since he's left office, he's done tons of different speeches about, the growth of social media and the resulting polarization, echo chambers, misinformation, all of that, right? I didn't want to like inundate people with studies here. Recent like academic sort of large scale studies have found that there is a little less extremism, or there's a little less like quantitative results that show that people are in filter bubbles. There have been a lot of research that shows naturally like there are people on political extremes or deep into groups that are unbelievably active, but the everyday user of a platform like Facebook or Twitter, even if that's a smaller number on Twitter, is actually seeing a pretty mixed type of sources, right? Seeing things that they agree with, seeing things that they disagree with. Studies show that like a lot of the people that we're connected to on Facebook are what we would consider like weak ties, like random people from college, people that you worked with once, or you don't work with anymore, extended family members. And often those are people that we don't agree with as much as our tight-knit family members. And so you do in fact see things that you disagree with on these platforms. And there was a book that came out a couple of years ago that I found that did a really cross-sectional surveying across 9 different what they identified as democracies across the world, and what was sort of happening on social media and in the real world. And they found that not only was the sort of impact of this type of stuff online not as pronounced as we might think, but also that there's a lot of evidence that suggests we do this kind of echo chamber filter bubbling in our everyday lives, right? That the people who are closest to us in our lives that we spend the most time with are often ones that we agree with, right? That we generally feel close to, that we share things with, right? So I think sometimes the focus on, being on Facebook, you're just seeing things that you agree with, you're never seeing things that you disagree with, is A, not quite true, according to a lot of studies, and B, some of those dynamics are just replicating things that happen in real life, that we obviously self-select, we create filter bubbles in our everyday lives, right? Obviously, social media makes this stuff potentially more visible, or potentially makes it more, I don't want to say explosive, but charged, right? Because it's so easy to just leave like a pithy comment to somebody in a way that you might not say that to them face to face, right? So I think it's also worth noting that increasingly, especially in like the last couple of years since, the dawn of the pandemic, media sources, researchers across communication research, science research in the sort of health realm have increasingly focused on what is sort of the mental health impact of heavy social media use. And in fact, last year, the Surgeon General put out this 30 to 35 page report that I can send Catherine via email if anyone wants to take a look, that has a lot of really interesting data that's collecting a lot of different sources. So a longitudinal cohort study of people 12 to 15, almost 6,600 adolescents, found that adolescents who spend more than 3 hours per day on social media face double the risk of experiencing poor mental health outcomes, including symptoms of depression and anxiety. A couple of the other things that are listed here, and tons of footnotes from all these different research, but just noting that, these studies point to a higher relative concern of harm, specifically in adolescent girls and those already experiencing poor mental health, as well for particular health outcomes, like cyberbullying, related depression, body image and disordered eating behaviors, poor sleep. Specifically, a lot of this on that side is connected to teen girls, right? More than boys. A majority of parents of adolescents say they are somewhat, very, or extremely worried about their child's use of social media. Could lead to anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, being harassed, exposure to explicit content, or pressure to act a certain way. The other thing from that I thought was really telling: perpetuate body dissatisfaction, disordered eating, social comparison, low self-esteem. 20 different studies points to this, right? When asked about the impact of social media on their body image, nearly half of girls 13 to 17 said social media makes them feel worse. Only 14% said it makes them feel better. And they're starting to find similar results in adults, right? So a study that was published last year, late last year, in a research journal surveying 5,300 adults whose average age was 56. These are longer studies that started in May and ran for a couple of years, trying to figure out like what's going on specifically related to COVID. They found similar results, right? That the use of visual apps in particular, like TikTok, Snapchat, and Instagram, for people over 35 was leading to depression, right? Or potential increased warning signs related to depression, right? So one of the things that's come out as a result of this is investigations into what do these social platforms know about their potential impacts or harms on their users, right? A big Wall Street Journal article that came out last year, or maybe late 2022, found that internally, since at least 2019, memos, things that have gone around, Facebook, or Meta, has known for a while that Instagram in particular, but also Facebook, has a really harmful effect on its users, especially women, especially teen girls. Their internal results at Facebook, which were leaked or discovered by Wall Street Journal, 32% of teen girls said that when they felt bad about their bodies, Instagram made them feel worse, right? So it's not only people thinking, okay, this is really bad for children and we need to sort of protect them, and studies showing that it could be bad for them. It's also impacting adults, and that more than likely the company has, all these companies have tons of internal data that says people who use this like feel bad about using it, right? Are we surprised by any of that information? Are we surprised by any of these surveys, these studies about the impact of social media on people's mental health? How do you feel when you use social media?
Well, it depends on which one I'm using.
Yeah.
Like I said, for Twitter, I use it the most, 100% political. I do absolutely nothing political on Instagram or Facebook.
Yeah.
Because Facebook, it's mostly people, relatives and people from Chillicothe that I've known my whole life. And so I try to stay very neutral. I don't comment, but boy, and so I'm getting a little bit of everything. So
Yeah.
Facebook is just more. So Facebook, I get irritated because although I don't post anything political, a lot of people, it's just constant reposting low thought memes.
Sure.
And so people that I've known and liked my whole life, I'm thinking, oh my God, what an idiot, or are people really that stupid?
Yeah. Right, which, and to interrupt, then I'll come back to you, that alone, like, there's this one strand of all this discourse about social media is like, we only see the things that we agree with, but then a lot of anecdotes that people share about their experience on social media is what you said, right? Actually seeing stuff that we disagree with on a platform like Facebook and feeling like, man, I didn't realize X person in my life was an idiot, right? Or having that feeling,
Right. Because you're looking like, oh,
yeah.
that's something.
Yeah. So what about, since you're super active on Twitter, do you always feel, not to like put you under a microscope in any way, share what you would like or not, do you always feel good using it? Like, do you feel like that was, I'm glad that I spent my 30 minutes doing that or whatever?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I get a lot of news off of, and Twitter used to be better. Twitter has changed since it's been sold and become X.
Totally.
But it used to be a great source of news.
Yeah.
And the news would come through on Twitter before it hit the major TV stations.
Yep. Yeah.
Now, who knows?
Yeah.
It used to be more like real time.
Yeah.
Coming through. The rhythms has changed on Twitter too.
Yeah.
And of course, you're always going to see Elon Musk post.
Yeah.
I don't know how he is. He just talk about misinformation.
Huh, yeah.
That's another one.
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel good about using Twitter.
Yeah.
But it also is confirming my beliefs and
Totally.
my ideology. I have a group of followers that are very faithful and very supportive.
Yeah.
And like I said, Facebook, it's friends and family, it's people I don't want to offend, so I stay completely off of anything controversial.
Yeah.
Happy birthday, I hope you feel better.
Yeah.
Hope somebody finds the lost cat over on Fifth Street. Instagram, I follow mostly some friends and celebrities.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing
Political.
I
Yeah.
don't follow anything political. So Instagram's real enjoyable. I
Yeah.
like knowing what Reese Witherspoon's doing.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I thank you for sharing. I mean, what your answer really underlines is like that these platforms, for some of us, not everybody, right? But the platforms do have like different uses, right? That even like the type of, and I'm doing it here, right? Standing up here and saying social media does X, right? Like X is a bad turn of phrase, given that that's what the platform is called now. But that social media as a whole has certain effects or impacts because every platform is its own thing and people use it for different reasons, right? And those uses and gratifications are different, and even how they make people feel is sort of different, right? That it's not unsurprising to that end that the ones that are more visually oriented, Instagram, for instance, are the ones that really clearly have impacts on, body image, right? Where you're seeing way more photos and videos, and the platform really prioritizes, a type of photo and a type of body, right? And the things that especially young women are seeing, or young girls, and how they're impacted by that. I'm curious, Catherine, as someone, you mentioned you're not using social media a lot, even just like for the library, is there a lot of, sort of conversation about like or what is the conversation about, like, how are we going to use social media? Has that changed at all? You know, like what platforms or approaches? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so, we now have a person who does most of our, yeah, so I used to do like the posts and stuff.
Yeah.
about the programs and the promotion, and trying to keep up with all of that.
Yeah.
was Just, I was very, very glad to hand that over.
Yeah.
But, so we post on Facebook and Instagram, and some of my colleagues make TikToks for the library.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we're too active on X.
Yeah.
We used to be somewhat,
Yeah.
I think we have a Goodreads thing that
Uh-huh.
sometimes we put things on.
Yeah.
But I would, yeah, but that's kind of been delegated.
Yeah.
To certain, members of our staff, which I was, yeah.
Happy
pretty
to,
confident.
yeah.
And after I didn't do that anymore, I occasionally go in to see like, oh, I wonder what the library's posted today.
Yeah.
Or, but.
And I think like institutionally, right, whether you're, sort of a nonprofit in public service, or you're, a corporation or whatever, right? Like, I think we've reached a point now where, especially, there's so many platforms, and people are very aware that we are totally beholden to the whims of what the platform and the people running it care about at any given time, right? That someone can buy Twitter and sort of completely reorient the prioritization of information, the way links actually get shared, what types of information that most people see, create, a back end like override so that you see one person's tweets the most, or, fire a bunch of people who work in trying to protect users in the circulation of misinformation, to things that are a little less overtly malicious or complex, with, Facebook at any given time deciding, we're really going to prioritize videos. So you're going to see more videos than you did last year. Oh, now we're going to prioritize credible information from news organizations. Oh, now people want to see less news. They don't care about news as much. So now you're going to see more of your, your actual connections, or the way in which now this year Instagram has announced that on Instagram and Threads, not Facebook notably, but on Instagram and Threads, it will default to not showing you political information, right? Or political content, I should say, which includes both like posts from political groups, campaigns, politicians, and, people in your circle who are posting videos about or photos about politics, but also news companies, right? When that rule related to no politics started to trickle out, there was some quick sort of third-party research into how is that impacting engagement on Instagram posts, and major news companies, NPR, Washington Post, New York Times, they saw their Instagram engagement dip anywhere from like 15 to 25% very quickly, right? So even if we're granting that these things have great uses and we enjoy certain things about them, we're so beholden to what they decide they care about at any given time, which can be really tricky. So I think companies constantly feel the pressure of like, well, there's a new platform, so we have to be on it, right? Like, if people are now using TikTok, we, I guess, have to be on TikTok, right? Whether that's a community library. The same thing is true of Bradley, right? I do the social media for our individual college of communications and fine arts, and this is like the third year I've done it, I think. And we only do Facebook and Instagram because you can simultaneously post stuff at the same time, and even that is just like exhausting, right? It should be a full-time job for one person, not somebody who also has 16 other things to do. And yeah, every semester, I work with students, and the conversation is sort of like, we should be on TikTok. And then I'm like, great, you're a creative student, you do it, and they make like one, and then they're like, oh, this is hard. I'm like, yeah, it is. That's why I don't do it, because so I think there is like a little bit of just larger, given this conversation about the impacts of social media and the number of platforms and the recognition that they can kind of do whatever they want with what they're prioritizing. I think not only are individual users, but companies also, or organizations, thinking like, do we really need to be on every platform, and who's going to do it? And do we have a full-time person? And if not, maybe we don't need to be on Twitter, or like maybe we don't need to be on YouTube, right? Or wherever it is, which I think is interesting. So I do want to talk about what are, possible interventions to improve our relationship to social media. I always like to start sort of really, really big picture and also like super serious to just talk about, because these things are out there, right? These are actual news or legislative things that are happening. So the kind of maximalist solution, how do we make our relationship to social media better? One way to do that is like government intervention, right? So we ban or severely restrict social media companies. Just this week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill in Florida that bans people under 16 from using social media without parental consent. Obviously, that is a complex law to enforce, given a number of different things, personal usage, all right. But that's been signed. There have been other things that have been thrown out. I think at one point, it was either Idaho or Wyoming, they banned TikTok like a couple of years ago. A bunch of states have obviously banned federal employees from using TikTok. That's obviously hard to enforce. We're in an environment right now where the federal government is considering an all-out ban of TikTok, as you may know, unless, it's sold to an American owner due to some convoluted concerns about, privacy and Chinese ownership, right, and mis and disinformation. And then the Supreme Court is considering right now whether or not platforms have First Amendment rights to moderate speech and what that looks like, right? So are essentially Facebook, the Twitters of the world, are they like utilities that essentially should enable anybody to post whatever they want? Or are they like magazines or like newspapers that have that make editorial decisions? The Supreme Court is hearing a couple of different cases in that regard to decide what do social media companies have the power to enforce, right? And I bring this up because, it's at least once a year, maybe multiple times a year, they trot out all of the CEOs of the social media companies. They go in front of a congressional committee or a Senate committee, and politicians basically say, Mark Zuckerberg, how dare you, sir? Like, do you not have any solutions for what to do? I think the most recent one was about mental health and suicides, people who, families were in the room who had children or family members who had committed suicide based on cyberbullying or things that happened to them on social media. And Zuckerberg kind of stood up and turned to the families and was like, I'm so sorry, we're doing everything we can. We have these kind of like public shows of like, you're doing bad, but then there's very, very little actual like teeth behind that. The last 6 months, there has been a little bit more effort to potentially push these things forward. So that's one solution. And when we get through these, I'm curious to hear what people think as far as what might work. The other one is obviously a larger scale effort of trying to persuade parents to prevent people who are under 18 from using social media or even smartphones altogether as long as possible, right? And I mentioned that anecdote about the study asking people how much they would pay to either use or get off social media from Jonathan Haidt. His book, I think, just came out today. He's got this full-scale book here about sort of the impacts of screen time, social media on kids under 18. And the big sort of thing he's pitching is basically get rid of the phones, right? For people under a certain age, no smartphones, no social media until they're 16 or 18 and making those decisions. And specifically, like, parents collectively need to come together and say, no, like, it doesn't matter if there's kids in your class when you're 12 that have an iPad or have a phone, you're not getting one, right? And you're not getting on social media, you're not getting on YouTube. Like, it's just collectively, we have to come together and have this sort of social pressure to say, the government's not going to help us. They're not going to ban these things. These companies are going to keep, spreading content and information or misinformation or whatever as long as possible. And so we collectively as people have to do something about that. As part of that Surgeon General report, there's a lot of similar kind of recommendations, maybe not full on like we're banning, right? But there's a whole chunk in there about what can parents do. And one of those suggestions is work with other parents to help establish like shared norms in a community, in a particular class, among a friend group, basically trying to say, we're all in this together. If I want to tell my kid that they can't use social media until 16, like it would actually work really well if you did the same, right? And the kids don't feel the social pressure, and then I don't feel like a bad parent for keeping them off of that, right? So we've got big picture, sort of government intervention or bans, bigger picture, like parents or adults coming together and saying, you know, especially younger people, given the vulnerabilities that may exist there, we need to protect them as long as possible with this type of thing. So those are the big picture kind of maximalist solutions. If you're thinking about like, okay, maybe those are hard to do, right? And I want to hear what people think as far as, are they too difficult or should we do them? I have 4 or 5 reasonable solutions that come from a lot of different sources and different presentations like this, things I've tried myself. You know, one reasonable solution is to think, if you're trying to have a healthier relationship with social media, track and evaluate your habits, right? One way to do that is obviously use your built-in phone or device screen time, you know, especially if you're an Apple user, but I know this exists in some form on other devices as well, that are telling you how long you're using particular apps, how long you're spending on your phone. You can build in, you know, downtime features. You can build in app limits where all of your apps close at a certain part of the day. You know, you can only use them for an hour a day, et cetera, right? We'll talk a little bit more about blocks in a second. That Surgeon General report also underlines, you know, how do you do this on a family scale, right? Think about what boundaries do we have at home? What time are we going to be off of screens? Where are we going to put our screens? Those sort of things. So, you know, it's pretty hard, generally speaking, to just stop using something that you actively use all the time. I think tracking it up front and sort of seeing, okay, this is actually how I use it, will give you a better understanding of what are ways that if I want to cut back or I want to use it differently, that I could potentially do that, right? It's often just really hard to say like, okay, I'm not using it anymore, right? Better to have more information about how you use it and then find ways to go from there. If you want like blockages, there are a lot of different ways to do that, actually. There are what are known as pay-to-play apps, right? Where you can use a product like Freedom, which I have used before as a Twitter addict, where you pay a certain amount and it's basically installed on all of your devices, and it just blocks you from opening it every time you open the app. There are also ones that are more that have more punishment. Like I've seen examples, like flash in the pan examples of this, where like you set it up to donate money to like a cause that you absolutely don't support, right? So like I'm a diehard liberal, and if I really need to curtail my use of YouTube or Twitter or whatever, and it blocks me, but then it says like, you know, if you really want to use it, this will donate $1, $5, $20, whatever you put in as your penalty, it will donate $20 to the RNC or whatever, right? And so it doesn't matter to you so much that you're willing to give money to causes that you hate or people that you hate. And that's pretty insidious and like, I think really, but that kind of reinforcement maybe works for people. But there are a lot of, I've liked Freedom. I've used it before. You know, just creating that short-term block, you know, obviously putting screens in other rooms. A strategy that I see a lot is kind of, you know, putting apps even into folders like on your phone so that you have multiple steps to get to them. You know, thinking about notifications, right, which is such an evocative way that these devices and apps get to us. You know, for a couple of years now, I have turned off like all notifications on my phone. I never get notifications. It works pretty well for me. That doesn't mean that that's the way to go, but that's something that has worked for me with things that I was picking up the phone too much. You know, and then you can target these things or filter them where I do, when my wife or my parents call me, it does actually, you know, ring, or I get a text from them. But if anybody else tries to contact me, or I'm using other apps, email, whatever, I don't see it. I have to actively choose to look at it. Obviously, I still do, and probably still too much for my own self, right? But that at least creates that block. I saw How to Do Nothing back there, a great book. There are tons of different devices, tons of different suggestions for how to basically do intermittent social media fasting, right? I think there's something a little complicated about using that sort of language to describe, you know, the comparison between, you know, unhealthy eating habits or healthy eating habits versus media use, but that's often how it's referred to. You know, a lot of advice is sort of find iterative ways to take days or weeks or long stretches away, especially during heightened controversies. You know, for instance, like I started using Freedom and stopped using Twitter like right after election day in 2020 because I was just like, I cannot deal with. I just remember specifically saying like, they're gonna like try to steal the election after the fact, and people saying like no, and then January 6th happened, which was you know, an example of that. But nonetheless, like for me, I was just like, I cannot be on Twitter every day thinking like what is going to happen with, you know, like state electors or unfaithful electors or whatever. Like I can't do it, so I'm off, right? But then get back on, right? There's a lot of advice about, you know, swapping social media connection for still digital, right? Not just saying like throw your phone in the trash, never use it. But if you want to use your phone, you know, things that are a little bit more personal, phone calls, FaceTime, Zoom, and spend time with people that you actually know, right? Thinking about what value each platform gives you and what you actually want, right? So if you do get a lot of, you know, you have a real community on a platform like Twitter, that doesn't mean stop using Twitter. It means think about like, okay, maybe I don't need these other ones, or I could use these other ones less and dedicate some of my energy to ones that give me pleasure, that don't make me feel bad, right? Two great books, How to Break Up with Your Phone and How to Do Nothing, provide a lot of, you know, different types of advice thinking about this. How to Do Nothing is obviously a little bit more militant about like, don't use your phone, don't use social media, go outside, look at birds, look at trees. Ginny Odell's book is a little bit more aggressive in a good way. And then the last one that I think that when I talk to people and speaking from my own experience, you know, being accountable to someone else when you're thinking about what relationship I might want to have with social media and how I change it, right? So one way is, and this is again, personal experience, allowing someone that you trust to like change your password and have your password on these social platforms if you don't want to be on them. You know, cooperative fasts, or, you know, we're going to do this together and not be on social media, being intentional about your communication and what you share. So like, you know, if you and a friend have agreed to not be on Twitter together, then you're not going to like send tweets to each other in text, right? That have been shared to you from someone else, or you saw something on Reddit and now you want to share it to them, you know, trying to be a little bit more specific and intentional with other people. And, you know, finding other interactive or participatory things to do that are still on your device, you know, games, things that can be competitive or social that are not being on a platform that maybe makes you feel bad, right? So those are some potential big picture and then sort of smaller iterative solutions. With our time here, I'm curious, what do we think are, or what do you think about those solutions or things that maybe have worked for you in the past about, you know, maybe using social media a little differently?
The first ones you mentioned make me a little nervous, thinking about how maybe social media has been used in maybe countries with very oppressive government, you know, and it's been a way for people to rally or connect, and thinking about like thinking of the government banning a whole platform or something, unless for I don't know how much national security really is tied up in TikTok and, and compromised, but you know, that sort of thing aside, that sort of control and banning makes me a little uncomfortable. But, and then like it seems like there's so much nuance nuance in all of this, you know, what is it about social media that is actually harmful to people?
Yeah.
Is it the screen time? Is it the particular apps?
Yeah.
Is it the particular images you're seeing?
Yeah.
Or like the ways that, you're using it and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
maybe that works into the, being intentional about why you're using it and what you're using it
Yeah.
for. And rather than just like, oh, I meant to check this restaurant's hours and now I've spent
20 minutes.
20
Yeah,
minutes
totally.
looking at all my friends that I knew 20 years ago.
Right.
And what their
Yeah.
kids are doing. Or something.
That's a great way to put it, right? That there is no universal reason that we use any of these things. There are people who use them very briefly each day or not regularly and are fine with it. There are people who are deeply addicted to them, and they are because of how the platforms work or because they have 10 other social and psychological reasons that have let, so it is really difficult to say we should just ban them, right? And certainly to your other point, I think what is a little, flimsy about the concerns over TikTok, right, is that we do know, like, categorically that, like, the US intelligence apparatus, like, use social media to, like, collect information on people, to profile people, to find, we know all of that from Edward Snowden and all of the sort of related, of like how our government uses social media, the various access points that they get through relationships with these tech companies. So the idea that, well, we just can't let, like, China do it to us, right? Like, it's okay if our own government spies on us or does whatever to us with social media, but, like, we just can't let a Chinese company do it. I personally find that a little spurious, right? Like, I understand the foreign government argument, but it's silly. We let all these companies do whatever they want, right? I think where we get to the point of, like, should the government do something is just like, I think people, as we see in these surveys, feel like powerless, right? And some of it is like there is addiction there. There are, like, the usage, the screen time, all of that, where people are like, this is bad. We see, people organize in these spaces to then go commit acts of violence. We see people, have committed acts of violence, who have consumed a bunch of stuff on social media or whatever, right? And it's just like, it appears that they have free reign, and then we bring their leaders in front of government and sort of say, like, how dare you, and then don't do anything about it. But then, yeah, I think I would ask most people, like, should we just outwardly ban social media? Oftentimes, or at least even informally, when I have conversations, then people get uncomfortable, right? Like, we don't want the government intervention to go that far, which I'm not saying I do, but it's just curious. Like, I don't know. It just comes down to then, like, you as a person have to decide what to do to feel better about your social media use. And sometimes it kind of feels like that the individual choice model of solving things doesn't totally work either, right? Because people obviously feel bad about their social media use, but don't stop in many cases, right? I don't know. What do you think?
I see social media kind of replace newspapers
Sure.
and magazines. I don't know, people that are a lot younger than me don't realize how much we loved our magazines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, years ago.
Yeah.
So I see the social media, we probably spent just as much time flipping through
Yep.
magazines and reading newspapers and when I
Watching the
would
news
get a
on TV,
newspaper,
totally.
I would get 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah.
Local newspaper. So it's kind of like social media is the newspapers and our magazines kind of all rolled into one.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so if people want to talk about how much time we spend on social media, but compare that to how much time we spend on various newspapers and
Yeah.
magazines.
Yeah.
I mean,
Or getting
So-
in together in a group and talking, or like.
Yeah.
different
Yeah. I mean,
ways of-
right. Yeah. And I mean, I think social media, obviously, it serves so many functions, right? That there are people who use it for heavy news consumption. There are people who just use it for entertainment. There are people who use it just to share there are people who use it to connect with former friends, new friends, right? To find career, like, it's again, to your point, that like it is sort of all consuming as far as the functions that it can serve for individual people, that it does become really challenging to try to determine like what every individual person ultimately has to decide what is a healthy relationship for them. And I think, speaking as someone who often feels kind of conflicted about their social media use and how it does make me feel, I think the kind of social pressures of using these things are really powerful, right? That like other people who I know are using them, or someone like me, some of the jobs or the opportunities that I've had have been the result of making connections over social media with people, just based on like generation in which I was, trying to find jobs and whatever, right? So I have this weird like loyalty to a platform like Twitter, where I've met a lot of interesting connections and colleagues around the world. But then I also like deeply hate it, right? I don't want to use it anymore. But then I feel like I'm missing out on what people in my professional networks are talking about, or potential other job opportunities or whatever, and that can be really, really difficult. And I don't love the focus on necessarily like we have to do something because children are in danger or people under 18, but increasingly the data shows that especially young people really struggle with what they're seeing, how often they're using these things. And if I was being idealistic, I would say like that's the only way we would change anything, right? Is that if enough people in society decide that if this is harming people who are much younger, that there might be some potential changes, whether that is sort of government intervention or it's just, sort of collectively trying to say, maybe we shouldn't let people under 15 have a smartphone, but that's really difficult and for more reasons than one, right? I don't know. I mean, I'm so glad that you came, because you have such a more of like a positive view on social media in some ways, right? A lot of times when I do these sessions, people are just like, it's bad. All of it's bad. We should get rid of it, So that's interesting, or at least of Twitter, or at least the community you've created, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Twitter, I know I'm in my own echo chamber, and that's okay, because that's where I want to be when I'm
And the awareness of that is really helpful too, right? Like knowing, look, I understand I'm having certain things reinforced to me, or I'm having my priors confirmed, but like, that's also why you hang out with people that are relatable to you or agree with you in real life too, right? Like those experiences are important. I'm curious if I can ask you, Catherine, just someone doesn't use social media a lot. Is that from like prior use and being like, I hate this, or just never deciding to participate on certain I'm just curious, it doesn't seem like you're sitting there thinking, I would like to have a different relationship with social media because it doesn't seem that significant for you.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I was a senior in college before I got on Facebook.
Yeah.
So, which is when it was kind of becoming, and that was so that I could message my family while I was overseas
Mm-hmm.
and kind of post the pictures so that you know what I was doing.
Totally. Yeah.
But I think I just got overwhelmed with the idea of needing to kind of cultivate a presence on
Yep.
each of those things.
Yeah.
And like one platform is a lot. And then if you're trying to do that on all these platforms,
Yeah.
it's like, I like being able to just like dip in and look at some things now and then.
Yeah.
But being active on one platform, let alone many, it's just, it seems to maybe add to just the clutter in my brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think I ever had like an intentional, I am not going to use Facebook anymore, but it just kind of faded away and I did not miss it, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't use it that, I mean, I scroll through the my age group, see if anybody's died.
Totally. Yeah.
And, who's sick, so on and so forth, but it's very quick, and
Yeah.
it wasn't intentional, it was just, I kind of got, I don't know, a little bit that out.
Yeah.
I think Twitter is more for people like to read too.
Absolutely. The Twitter user is a heavy news, heavy political, heavy media. Those kind of three are like
Right.
absolutely people who
I'll
use
read
Twitter.
that, the Atlantic,
Totally.
somebody's posted about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say Twitter though, that, I don't know how closely the other ones are regulated, but Twitter, there's no regulations now, and the porn bots and the
Yeah.
porn that's on.
Yeah.
Is unbelievable, and I'm not a prude, I'm not.
Right.
Easily offended, and just even today, when I think about like, probably four people that were trying to follow me, and when I went through and met it, I was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, I could see not wanting anybody, younger people doing that, just that accidentally scroll through somebody's
Yeah.
profile, and who knows, if they could see something really wild.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that plays a role in the concerns that people, you know, if you Google, not to go back to the filter bubble, the like fallacy, but just, you know, news related articles in the last year about like parents and parent groups and people coming out and saying like, we, you know, just like what people are seeing in their kids as far as the amount of time that they're spending on certain platforms. I think it's fair to make the case that, you know, like what can a 2024 teenager or preteen is doing on their devices, you know, is in some ways a parallel to when I was a kid, like all the concerns about TV, right? Those sort of moral panics about every media are, they're a little hyperbolic and heightened. But I think just the speed and the degree at which people have access to these things, it is, you know, it does raise, I guess, my perspective has changed, I guess, as a millennial who actively used social media for so long. I think that there are things that maybe, yeah, whether culturally or socially, we need to have more of a perspective of how do we do this, finding something that works for you as opposed to the pressure of like, you have to be on it, to the point of even, I think college plays a huge role in this, where like not only the social aspect of it, and it trickles down to K through 12 too, but like what you mentioned really spoke to me of like when I was in college, there was so much focus on, you know, don't put certain things on social platforms, but like you need to be there, right? And you need to be in those spaces, and you need to like make sure that people can find you and that sort of thing for jobs or whatever, but don't post photos of you at a party, but like be on the platform. And I think even now you see a tension with college students where like they actually use it a lot. Like I'll find my students in some form or another, not actively find them, but I'll encounter students on Instagram, on certain platforms, and like they've never posted anything. But then when you ask them like how often are they on the platform, they're like, oh yeah, 2 hours a day. They're just looking at stuff as if it's their TV or whatever. Yeah, you're gonna.
Oh, I was just curious, you have kids and.
Yes, I have a 3-year-old. Yeah.
Do you have an idea of how you're going to approach this in your family?
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I talk about it, you know, quite a bit. And we've generally, we always say like good screen, bad screen, which is like a silly, like we're making a joke because, you know, we let our kid watch TV. But we don't generally, we like don't let him look at a phone. We don't let him look at it. We only let him look at an iPad. Like my in-laws live 9 hours away. So when we're driving that distance, sometimes, you know, you got to bust out Cars 2 on the iPad, right? But we've tried to keep it to just like television, right? And that's pretty much it. But that's also like because how I was raised to some extent, right? And obviously, you know, I've done presentations about like this before about like, you know, we sort of completely stigmatize screen time, but you know, like there is good screen time, right? Like you can let kids use an iPad or a phone to do like math. You know what I mean? Like it's not just literally putting a screen in front of them is bad. It's the type of thing they're showing them. So, you know, we've been really intentional about what we show him. But we've tried to not let him get so like immediately hooked on the the physicality of the device. But even still, I mean, he's 3, and he has a speech delay, so his communication is complicated. But even him, you know, he's such a visual learner because of the speech delay. And, you know, a year ago, he just would pick up the phone and start like, and just from seeing us, and also just, it's so freaking intuitive. And Jonathan Haidt, who has that book out, he writes about that in the Atlantic piece that came out a couple years ago, that his kids are older now, but when the first iPhones came out, he was like, my kids were toddlers, and how quickly they took to them. He was like, at the time, I thought like, wow, this is such a progressive, innovative, like it's going to be great for society. And he's sort of reflecting now and being a little bit more alarmist. But yeah, I mean, I think it changes. Some days I'm just like, never, he's never going to have a device. And even now, I mean, we basically only Sesame Street and Bluey and Pixar, some Pixar movies. That's all we do. And we're really in a Sesame Street mode right now because we're really trying to help with the speech. But yeah, I think it'll probably change. But we're having a lot of conversations about it for sure. But I know that, you know, you fall victim to the same, you're like, got to be serious about screen time. And then you're like, you're trying to work for 20 minutes and you're just like, okay, here's Elmo, you know, like it's really hard to not, you know, rely on that, whatever screen we're talking about, whether it's a big screen in front of them or like a small screen that they're interacting with, right? Yeah. Yeah, totally. I say all the time, I'm like, I don't want to look at, I need to keep my phone in my room, right? Or my bedroom and not look at my phone after 7 p.m. That's often what I say. And then like that's so I can just watch TV, you know, like it's just like I'm putting my phone away so then I can watch television unabated, right? Not with distraction. Which I still think is a productive use because multitasking really rewires your brain in a funky way. But yeah, even that, you're still making those designations like, okay, this is a good screen, or like, you know, I'm watching a documentary. So like this is edifying in a way that like looking at Twitter is not, right? Or whatever. Yeah. Anyway. Well, thank you. And thanks for folks maybe watching after the fact. Next month, April 30th, last day of the month. I just have the calendar pulled up. Tuesday the 30th, we'll be talking about the death spiral of local news and the complications related to that. So maybe interesting to you and some folks who were here previously. I think that will be a really interesting combo. So thanks everybody, folks watching after the fact. My email's on the screen there. You can reach out if you have any questions.